I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. My name is Rosa Parra.
My name is Carlos Aguilar.
My name is Manuel Betancourt, and I'm a
Tomato Meter
approved
Approved
critic.
Y hoy en Critical Thinking estaremos hablando de películas de terror en español.
Today on Critical Thinking, we're taking a look at the best Spanish language horror films.
Latino Heritage Month takes place from September 15 to October 15.
Right in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month, and right as we are kicking off spooky season and Halloween just around the corner.
In honor of celebrating Latinos and our talent and our stories, let's go ahead and talk about some Spanish language horror movies.
Before we get into my favorites, I don't think we can have a conversation about great Spanish language horror without talking about 1931's Spanish Dracula.
Back in the 1930s, as movies were using sound and dialogue, the talkies, before sophisticated techniques of subtitling and dubbing existed, they would actually shoot the same film shot by shot with an entire new crew and cast in Spanish.
During the day, you had this English-speaking crew filming the English language Dracula movie.
I am Dracula.
And then at night, the Spanish-speaking crew would come and film the Spanish version of the film.
Soy Dracula.
An English-speaking director who would have to direct his Spanish-speaking actors through a translator would recreate the scenes for Spanish-speaking audiences.
They would use the same sets, they used the same markers. It was essentially the same script, but if you watch both films back to back, the Spanish language one is close to a half hour longer.
And there's been this conversation around the movies, whether which one is the better one. A lot of people say it's the Spanish-speaking one.
The director of the Spanish language Dracula had a chance to see the footage shot during the day in English and sort of course correct the things that he didn't like about that direction. And that resulted perhaps in the Spanish language version being better, or at least more daring in some of those choices, because that director had access to how the English crew had shot it.
For the longest time, it was kind of forgotten. The film premiered in Cuba, premiered here in the US, in Mexico, and Spain. But it was a financial flop. People didn't really respond to it, and so it kind of disappeared for decades. And eventually they found an incomplete print that screened in '77 at MoMA, and then eventually they found a complete print of the Cinemateca in Havana, Cuba, that then got restored. In the early 90s, it was released as a VHS, and it was hugely successful. It's kind of been rediscovered, and it's hard then not to play comparisons.
Now there's subtitle and dubbing, and the industry is far more global now, and streamers create Spanish language content that only exists for those markets, or that's really just thought specifically for those markets. But the fact that Hollywood was, even back then, investing more than it is today in Latino talent and Spanish language content is interesting, and also kind of sad that that model wasn't transformed into something to continue including Spanish-speaking talent.
If you were looking to add films to your October to watch list, your run up to Halloween, check out any of these films.
My favorite 5 Spanish-speaking horror movies, they all have they're obviously different movies from one another, but collectively I feel that they have lingered with me since I first watched every single one of them.
When I was thinking about 5 films to highlight, I definitely wanted to step away from some of the ones that are better known. Of course, I love the work of Guillermo del Toro and Jairo Bustamante and Isa Lopez and other Latin American filmmakers who've made horror, but wanted to highlight someone like Carlos Enrique Taboada, who has a great legacy when it comes to horror in Mexico, but might not be as popular abroad.
Horror, I find in Latin America, doesn't live in a kind of different place, which is why a lot of these films feel very historically grounded. They feel very context specific.
4 out of the 5 are just social political commentary, and a lot of these stories aren't necessarily taught in history classrooms. So the movies themselves act as a historical archive in a way.
They really don't operate with this idea that the supernatural and the sort of day-to-day are different entities or different spheres or different environments. They're kind of like constantly intertwined, and there's a fine line, almost like a veil or a shroud. And if you just like push it just far enough, then you can find the horrors on the other side.
These horror movies make you realize that the true villain, the true monster in a lot of these stories are the humans. My favorite out of the list. I love how Jairo Bustamante takes a tale or legend like La Llorona and then gives it a different twist. It gives her a different meaning.
It was a folktale that I grew up with, right? This weeping woman, La Llorona, who's wailing and weeping because of her lost kids.
Here, she is the representation of the many, many Mayan lives that the government has killed. There's been this ongoing genocide against the Mayan population, and she comes as the representative of all the lost souls. So she's the voice of the voiceless, pretty much. She wept because she had visions of the future, nothing to do with the husband or murdering her kids or her children being dead or any of that. And here he's bringing her meaning back to the Mesoamerican roots.
The backdrop to the horror is the political context of Guatemala, the genocide of the indigenous people there. And so because, the reality is so harsh and so difficult, justice in this movie comes by way of the otherworldly.
I think this is one of the things that a lot of contemporary Latin American filmmakers are doing, which is like they're grounding their horrors in embodied histories. These are metaphors, but they're metaphors that are really grounded and visceral. And so by the time, this film unleashes all of its horrors, you do leave learning more about this country, about this dictator, and also about complicity.
The movie doesn't heavily rely on jump scares. It's very slow. It is a slow burner movie. It takes its time, but it's so powerful and impactful with the story that it's telling.
Folktales really serve that purpose of giving us solace or explaining the things that we can't explain and that perhaps are difficult to grapple with as human beings. In Latin America, that's a constant part of how we understand the world,
There was this specific scene, I still get chills just thinking about it, where it's the famous trial scene where you have an indigenous woman. She's testifying. The shot starts as a close-up, so you can just see her head. And then the camera slowly pans away from her face, just very, very slowly. You're hearing the details. You're hearing how their food and their crops were being stolen. You are hearing how the husbands and the brothers and the uncles and all the men were being murdered. You're hearing a lot of detailed experiences. Just bone chilling. And then as the camera keeps panning out, there's a cameo by Rigoberta Menchú, who is an indigenous rights activist and a Nobel Peace Prize recipient. And the fact that she was sitting there made the whole entire scene much more powerful. The woman who's testifying, she asked if she can alter some of the script lines because she wanted to testify what she experienced at the time. So this is an actual survivor testifying and letting all of us know what she experienced, what her family went through. And that alone just, I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it and remembering that, because it's infuriating to hear everything she experienced, but at the same time, it's very hopeful, and I appreciate Jairo Bustamante going out of his way and getting actual survivors and people who experienced this just to tell their stories. And I was not expecting to get emotional, sorry.
This was his number one. Oh, wow. That's a weird one.
The Untamed is really a unique film in recent Mexican cinema. This is a movie by a filmmaker named Amade Escalante. It takes place in Guanajuato, which is the state where the director's from. That in itself already sort of makes it unique. You know, it starts with this open, vast spaces, you know, in the countryside, which is where a couple are hiding this creature in a shack. The alien creature that these people are hiding provides pleasure to humans, but it can also turn violent. So there are scenes where there are encounters between humans and this creature who also really hurts the people that are engaging in these erotic encounters with it. And so the person that's doing it has to also go out and find other people to bring to the creature. And all that happens as the movie also deals with domestic violence and with homophobia in Mexican society, the sort of notions of like how shameful people feel about the things that bring them pleasure, whether that's sexually or otherwise. And so the notion that this creature, which you eventually get to see, and it's done with like these really fascinating visual effects that were done by a Danish company. They feel very, you know, otherworldly or extraterrestrial, I should say, but again, grounded within the context of what's happening in Mexican society. And I think just the blend of those two things makes for an incredibly unique piece of filmmaking. And I think for me, it's the best movie that Amade Escalante has done so far, and one of the gems of recent Mexican cinema.
This is not a film that traffics in jump scares, or there's no slashers, there's no moments of real tension, but there is a sense of dread throughout.
If people expect a movie that is sort of straightforward horror, that's not what this is. You do get to see some gruesome stuff if that's what you're after, but I will say that what's interesting about the movie is the blend of the extraterrestrial horror or the sci-fi horror with the social commentary.
The level of originality in this film, I think, really sets it apart. This film is kind of unclassifiable because it is a little bit of like lo-fi sci-fi. It is, like I said, it's a little bit of a melodrama. It truly is about horror at its most sort of elemental. I'm so happy that it's on someone else's list and that other people really hopefully will be checking it out. I absolutely adore Pan's Labyrinth, Guillermo del Toro's El Laberinto del Fauno.
Pan's Labyrinth is my favorite of all of Guillermo's. I shouldn't say Guillermo's, like he's my friend.
Pan's Labyrinth, I believe it's his like gem. I mean, taking film courses, you learn about the mise-en-scène, you learn about imagery, you learn about visual storytelling. And every single course I've taken, they use clips from this movie.
I think it's one of the best movies sort of ever made, full stop. Part of it is the beauty of it. For a movie that's so gothic and that's so dark and that it's very much a kind of fable, fairy tale, parable about Spanish fascism, there's a tender beauty with which it's created and which it was presented. And a lot of it has to do with the way that it's sort of anchored by this point of view of this child, Ofelia, who is trying to make sense of this increasingly violent and dangerous world around her. The way that she clings to her life and the world that she knows is through this fantasy world. And to do that, according to the faun that she meets, she has to succeed at these 3 challenges. And that allows Del Toro to sort of constantly play with this idea that we have this fairy tale, this fantasy land, on the one hand, that might be a kind of respite, a kind of rescue, a kind of refuge. And then on the other, we have this violent, patriarchal, really aggressive, sort of masculine world where the fascist Franco regime is tamping down on any kind of resistance and really breaking down anything that is about community, that is about artistry, that is about beauty, that it's about coming together and a kind of freedom. And the shuttling between the two, I think, is one of the things that Del Toro does so well. There's a kind of elasticity to the storytelling where he really shows you, real life horrors. And then these fairy tale moments aren't kind of Disneyfied or really fanciful, but they're actually kind of dark. I think there's a reason that, the pale man, this like man who has his eyeballs in his hands, played by the great Doug Jones, is so striking because it's such a simple and simplified kind of monster. But what he represents, right, this kind of like hoarding of food, right? He has this banquet right in front of him that Ophelia is supposed to ignore, even though it's designed to lure children in, because that is what he feeds on.
The Pale Man has become such an iconic character. Everybody knows who it is. Its impact and its cultural zeitgeist, it's still felt today.
That really, to me, embodies sort of like what's beautiful about Del Toro's filmmaking, which is that he brings the otherworldly into the real world in a way that it's not only within the fiction, but in the reality. Like, this creature is on set physically because someone's performing it and the sets are there, rather than just being done in CG or added later.
You just can't take your eyes off of it. That creature is just so unlike anything else, and it's so beautiful and it's so entrancing, and it's also so disgusting, and you're terrified of it in the way that Ophelia is. As terrifying as it can be, and I think some of the most terrifying moments are actually not part of the fantasy world, but actually part of the sort of the real world. It allows the horror to feel more real and maybe more uncomfortable. I adore this film. The score by Navarrete is one that like I'll put on when I'm writing. I love that kind of like twinkling lullaby that has a kind of like dread underneath it. I think this is the best film Del Toro has made so far. I think it is his like magnum opus. It plays to all of his strengths, the craftsmanship, the artisanship, the way that the world that he's created feels lived in, and there's a texture to it as if you could almost like taste it or feel it. It is just a beautiful film, and I've been thinking about it now for close to 2 decades, and I don't think I'll ever tire of watching or talking or thinking about it.
I would encourage, people who like horror to venture out and watching, horror films from other countries. In this case, in Spanish, whether that's, from Spain or Latin America, because I think that it reveals different things about what people in other countries find terrifying. It's always interesting to see the horror tropes being explored from perspectives that we might not often see or even think about.
One of the joys of cinema is being able to step into a different world, and different worlds. I think Spanish language horror is a great way to sort of dip your toes into cultures and folktales and mythologies and monsters that you may not know or that you may know, but you'll be offered a kind of like different experience.
Every country has their own issues. I think some people would be able to relate to some of the issues that are being depicted. Others are just maybe fond of maybe the visual storytelling aspect. To me, the Spanish language horror genre has a deeper impact because of its language, because of its culture. A lot has to do with the social commentary, as I mentioned, but again, for me, it's the language itself. It's so powerful, it's so potent that, going back to the Dracula, there's one versus the other, and a lot has to do with the language itself.
What is your favorite Spanish language horror film? Please let us know in the comments.